This episode of Between Turns is brought to you by this episode of Between Turns. Well, specifically, the first half is brought to you by the second half, and the second half is brought to you by the first half because it's a two-parter. If that's all confusing, don't worry, it'll sort itself out about halfway through. Now, on to the show. Going back to the start, you had mentioned to me, dude, you have to play BattleCon, because I had brought Pixel Tactics over. And we played the mess out of that game and loved it and just thought it was unbelievably cool. And at the end, you giggled and pointed over your shoulder and said, well, if you love this, you're going to be just blown away by that. And pointed at BattleCon. Then we kind of let it drop just because there was other stuff on the docket. You know, I saw the notice about the Kickstarter and said, gosh, I mean, we gotta play this thing. And I had a casual understanding that I probably was going to enjoy it for various reasons. But again, I was hoping that maybe I wouldn't, so that I could just kind of be like, okay, done, and walk away. Gosh darn it, that game is just so stinking good. And again, for, well, I guess not entirely inexplicable reasons, because that would be a really short podcast.
No. Well, here's the thing, like from my end, that I find interesting about it. You know, it's one of those games that I'm willing to like walk around the neighborhood and knock on the doors and like, have you heard about our Lord and Savior BattleCon? You know, there's a reason. You know, it's funny to me that game strikes me that way because, you know, there are a million Euro games that come out that I play, and I'm like, this is fantastic. And I go put it on Board Game Geek, and I give it the 8 rating, the 10 rating, whatever. Like, this is really good. And then I don't talk about it again, right? Unless it comes up in just a regular conversation. Because I guess my feeling is that it's a heavy Euro. It's really, really good. Like, say Vinhos, right? Like, I play that. Like, this is amazing. It's a 9. It's a 10. And then I put it on my shelf, and we take it out. We play it occasionally. We talk about how awesome it is, and I put it back. But I don't really talk about it outside of that because the Euro fans that are into those kind of games, like super heavy, crunchy Euros, they're going to find this. They're going to look at it. They're going to see it, a picture of it, and go, I really want to try that. And they're going to go try it. Where BattleCon's different is I know that people look at the box and they go, what is this nonsense? They just would never in a million years even sit down at it. Like it looks, the artwork is busy. The cards themselves are kind of ugly. The text on the cards is dense. Everything about it would just be like, this is too much to take a shot on, right? And I think the fact that I want people to like look past that, like, no, seriously, you need to try this, is what makes me kind of a little bit of a feeling like I need to spread the gospel of this. And it's a similar thing that comes up in some of the other level 99 games. Sure, we'll do a show later on Argent Consortium and all that, but it's much the same phenomena. The artwork is incredible, but it's anime, which is kind of an acquired taste anyway. Personally, I look at it and I'm like, it's so detailed. Like this is incredible artwork, but it does not appeal to me. It looks busy. It's almost too much going on. You know, there's so many details and so many colors and so many weird angles that, you know, I find it a little bit off-putting just as a whole. So again, it's something a game that everything about it, I should make it so that I don't like it. And the fact that I play it and I'm like, this is one of the best games in my collection. Like, this is an amazing, amazing thing that I will buy everything that comes out for it, and I will probably be going out at my estate sale when I'm dead because I have no reason to get rid of this ever. It's fantastic, you know. And that weird, that dichotomy, that appearance of it, you know, what my first impression would be just looking at it, and then how it actually turns out to be, makes me feel like there are a ton of people out there that are going to look at this that I know would really, really enjoy it, and they're going to look at it and go, ew, keep walking, you know. And I think that kind of makes me a little bit preachy about, like, this game is amazing, you got to try it, seriously, try this. So, you know.
Well, so I will push back a little bit on the whole stylistic thing, because again, I know that, you know, the anime style is kind of level 99's shtick, you know, in terms of their visuals. But that aside, if you're making a game that's supposed to be a board game version of what you would normally do on your console, those games are 90% all anime based in terms of their visuals. And they're all bright and colorful and loud and all just epileptic seizures waiting to happen. And it kind of fits. And there's a lot about this game that is a love letter specifically to that genre of video game. And not even just that particular subset of video games as it stands now. It's almost a love letter to not even the ones historically, but kind of the whole lineage of them and even their art, which I think is really cool. And I know that's actually probably even a smaller subset of the gaming crowd, right? Not even just the people that like anime, but the people that specifically enjoy fighting games and also anime. But with that said, I do think it kind of frames it in a way that, at least for me, I can appreciate it because I can see that come through. And I can see that it is this sort of appreciative work. And even though I don't play those types of video games, I kind of get to feel like I am. And I'm not just playing something that is just, well, it's not a slapped on theme. Like that theme is not just visuals in terms of theme. It actually plays out in terms of the mechanics too, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, the Jeff-centric version of what you just said is that's another aspect of it. Mm-hmm. As to what I was saying before, I don't play fighting games. I hate fighting games. Video games. I'm talking video games. They're work. I've played my share throughout time. I've spent 20 minutes on Super Smash Brothers. I played Soul Calibur here and there. You know what I mean? I've played them. It's not like I have zero exposure. Mm-hmm. But, my experience with them is always, you sit down, you go, man, this game looks amazing. And then you mash buttons and watch the cool, like, epileptic, shiny, flashing lights. You do that for about half an hour, and then you're like, fine, done. I mean, I shouldn't say you do that. That's what I do, because it's just button mashing. It's meaningless. Mm-hmm. I know enough about it, just in general, just from observationally and exposure and gaming, that there is an incredibly deep move, counter move kind of game going on there. Where to me it's joystick up punch, joystick in the middle, up punch, joystick down, mid punch. Like, that's your combo. Like, who cares? Punch, kick, jump. And I play them that way, so they're not interesting. But, like I said, I know through this kind of osmosis of being around them that there's this incredibly deep chess match going on that is just a fascinating kind of strategy game. Mm-hmm. And practically, for me, it's work. I don't see, and again, it's a disconnect. I mean, it's a total hypocritical disconnect. I get that. But, it just sitting there with a character and learning 36, 40 moves for this character so that I can instantly recall them never seemed like an interesting enough game to do that. And that may be because people around me weren't all that into it either. Because, like a CCG or anything else, the small microcosm of your kitchen table, like, the more competitive it is, the more you get into it on any game. So I just never had that kind of environment around me, so I never got into it. And like I said, it seemed like too much work. Well, we take this BattleCon here, and again, this thing that I have very, very little interest in, more than hey, that's cool and whatever. And you put it in board game form, and it's the exact same thing. It's 40 moves, counter moves, 35 or whatever it comes out to be, in card form, where I'm processing it and I'm looking and I'm comparing stats and laying down these cards and bluffing and anticipating and, movement on the board. Suddenly, it's this just amazing experience, this amazing strategic and tactical dueling experience. And then suddenly now I understand it all, including the video games.
Yeah, and that's cool that this is actually really similar to what I was talking to you a while back about, how it took a video game for me to appreciate CCGs. And in this case, is taking a board game to sort of peel off this layer that exists over in these other video games. And that's so stinking cool. Even like, you were talking about the moves and the counter moves. Like one thing I was thinking about, in regards to those cards, because they're super cool, because essentially, well, as you pointed out to me, one set stays the same and one set is the part that's partial to your character. Well, the set that stays the same are the moves. They are the verbs of what you're doing, striking, dashing, whatever. And the part that makes it your character are the adverbs that make it your move specifically. And you're putting 2 of these cards down to make a move. And that is so incredibly cool in its own right because of the opportunities it gives you and the strategy that you have to sort of think through, not only in terms of your own hand management, but in terms of looking across the table and seeing what's coming down the line. But to bring it back to what you just said, this is actually in a kind of a little subtle way, and I assume it was intentional. This is actually a nod to the way that those games play out, because you have 2 hands on a controller. One is your direction, and one is the button.
Right.
And so you have these 2 cards. One is essentially your direction, and one is your button. And that is unbelievably cool to me, that even that just tiny little aspect of what makes those games work and the things that your brain sort of has to do is mimicked in this. And that's just another way that theme comes through. And it's such a subtle thing. And maybe it's not even there. Maybe I'm projecting that, but it seems really rad to me.
No, I think it's absolutely there. And I think that's a very keen observation. I hadn't thought of that, but you are absolutely right. That the one deck of styles, is the buttons, and the other deck is the moves.
Oh yeah.
The recreation of that whole environment is just so well done, and it reminds me of, again, there are other games like Millennium Blades doing this with taking, like, not just a CCG. Like, it's not enough to just make a CCG, but we're going to make a game that simulates the entire meta of CCG gaming in every aspect of it, from buying to trading. And that's such an amazing feat, And then here you look at BattleCon, and it is literally done the same thing for fighting games of a video game. And it doesn't just stop with the basic game, right? As you said earlier, one of the amazing parts is not only did it recreate Street Fighter X, right? Not just basic Street Fighter is what you get when you play with the basic rules of BattleCon. Not only does it do that amazingly well, but then there's all these modules you can plug into it in the game. And the modules walk you through the entire evolution of fighting games. Every one you add, you're adding another iteration of the next generation of fighting games.
Yeah.
There's a module for tag teams where you have the 2 guys fighting instead of just the one, and they hop in and out of off on the board. There's another one where, you can have a set of characters that you pick that don't actually fight, but they just leap into the battle, fire off a giant combo, and then vanish again.
Yeah.
Like the stuff that Marvel Capcom used to do. There's an entire module that is essentially a Double Dragon game where you're walking across this side-scrolling map, and dudes are running out to fight you, and you're using the BattleCon mechanics to beat all the thugs up and, like, run through this dungeon. It is amazing the ground that is covered by everything that exists in this BattleCon universe.
I hadn't really thought about it taking you through the historical arc of those games, but you're exactly right. It does that, and that's kind of unbelievably cool. Man, oh my gosh, we actually should do a little campaign.
I think you could just add them one at a time. Even they added this force gauge thing, which is the new tournament standard, and it's a good mechanic. We played with it a lot yesterday when we played. But even that, like the force gauge thing is kind of one of the iterations of that, right? There wasn't anything like that in Street Fighter. That was something that came later, and they all have it. Like the more you take it in the face, the stronger the counterpunch is going to be when you fired off your super move.
Well, what I was just going to say though is that, right now we've been talking all this time about, how well it is a fighting game, and it absolutely is. I mean, it gets that feel. You get that sort of sort of momentum and being caught off balance and off kilter if something misses, and just all those really cool things that get the tempo of that experience, the fighting experience. Like, that's all there. However, it's there in this like staccato fashion where you get these, maybe 2 minutes of reveal when the cards come out, where you see that sort of pace of the game, and then it's almost like everyone hits the pause button and you're able to pull up your list of moves and try to figure out the next thing. So it's actually an incredibly thoughtful game as well. Whereas with a fighting game on screen, you're going to spend most of your time basically building up muscle memory. You memorize your list and you try to build up muscle memory and attach that muscle memory to certain situations and that kind of stuff. So you end up playing instinctively. In this game, you actually are having to really do a lot of kind of critical thinking about not only what you should do in analyzing the situation you're in, but even looking across the table at what the other player's done and sort of deducing what they're going to do. I mean, we had that one game where I just frustrated the ever-loving mess out of you, where I basically was just skunking your hand right at the start of every single turn. It became incredibly tricky because there was almost this bluffing game about, was I going to use my power that nuked your hand right at the start?
Yeah, and I had to intentionally play moves that didn't work. Like, this move is going to do nothing, but I was doing that with the intention of you canceling it.
Exactly.
So that I could play the move I wanted to play.
It almost was that scene from The Princess Bride, where you're kind of going, do you think that I know, or do I know that you think that I know? And it was awesome, and it actually created some really good tension that wasn't just tension that happened after the fact when we saw a situation. It was tension in real time. And that's kind of the really cool thing about this, is that it has these two very different things going on. It has the thoughtfulness component of it, which is there. I mean, the game is pretty difficult. I mean, trying to figure out how to make stuff happen sometimes is very hard. However, when you lay down the cards and you're looking at resolving them, you feel like you're right back in this really quick game. And that shouldn't work. It shouldn't work at all. Those two things should bump into each other and something should get booted off the board. But somehow it works. And you walk away feeling like you both had this fast, frenetic experience, but you also were mentally tired. I don't know. I thought it was great. Yeah. At least, I mean, well, I thought the whole thing was great, but I thought that one particular aspect was just unbelievable.
Yeah, well, another one of those hidden little surprises, little nuggets of something that should be really hard to capture, yet this game does it, is almost precisely that. The layers of the game are so deep and so many that you can play it completely tactically, which is the equivalent of button mashing, right? Like, you can just take the cards in your hand at any given time and match them up, the ones that do the most damage, and lay them down and see what happens. And you can play that way, and sometimes it'll work, and sometimes you'll even win, and you'll have fun, And again, that's button mashing. But if you take the time to learn the characters and you take the time to learn your opponent's characters, then suddenly that depth we talked about with the people that study this one character and know all of its moves and can just fire them off from muscle memory, that whole thing kind of comes to the front of even this game, because once you not only understand tactically what's in your hand and what cards fit together, but you can start timing up which pairs are in your hand at any given time and which parts of the turn you can hit and where you're at on the board, like which spot on the board you need to be on to have the most effective use of any set of cards that happens to be, in your decks. The fighters have sweet spots. There's fighters that want to be on the corners, fighters that want to be in the middle, fighters that want to be on space 2 or space 7 specifically. Just weird stuff like that. That is, again, it's true from fighting games. There's guys that want to pin you in the corner. There's guys that want to juggle you. And this game does that. And if you take the time to learn someone, suddenly you're now doing that thing where you're not just thinking like, this is what's in my hand. You're thinking, that card's over there in my discard pile. 2 turns from now it will be in my hand, so I need to hold this card until that card gets back to me. And there's all that to learn. And then you can also start learning your opponent and start tracking his cards. Like, if you really get into this, to where you're playing in the super competitive tournaments and stuff. It's to the point where you're holding moves because you know your opponent has a counter and you know how many turns ago it's going to be till that counter's back in their hand. And then it gets back into that, I know what you know, what I know thing. That's super deep and super amazing. But the amazing, the most fascinating part about it for me is the fact that the game works both ways. It isn't like it becomes the button mashing aspect of just playing random cards doesn't become uninteresting. And the idea of learning it so deep that you can be bluffing at that level and knowing both characters also seems super interesting. So it does both things. That even carries over to the super move, the finishing moves, right? The overload things you do when you have 3 life left. I think that's a super fascinating mechanic too, because again, it kind of reminds me of the button mashing part, because it's predictable, right? When your opponent is going to use it. So it's super predictable. So anyone who is good at that game is going to dodge it every time. But if you have a button masher player who's just playing tactically, if they can land that, it makes the game. These things are fire off 10 damage, instant win. And it's just this amazing experience for the person who just pulled it off. But even though that super broken thing is in the game where it's a one-turn win, a competitive player is never, ever going to get hit by it. And I think that's not a bad thing. That lets 2 people that are just kind of poking around have these amazing moments. And yet it holds up in an environment where those big, flashy, shiny, lucky wins aren't important and are meaningless. Those players aren't bothered by them because they're so easy to work around. And again, that sounds like a bad thing, but I don't think it is in the end, because it lets novice players have fun, and it lets strategic players not be bothered by the fun, by the silly RNG aspect of the game. They can ignore it completely because it's so easy to dodge. Again, just such an amazingly crafted thing to capture that whole world in the box.
Oh man, absolutely. Well, the thing that I think is just incredibly nuts, right? So we played 4 games in one sitting, I think, and each time had a different character. And yes, what everyone's going to say, all the characters are totally different and have different powers. But what this, in a lot of ways, means, at least in terms of what I sort of saw, is that it makes you focus on a different part of the game. So as you build it to me, like the little elevator pitch was, the game is so simple in terms of what you do on your turn. The actual basic turn order and the mechanics of the game you can fit on a postage stamp. However, each character is just a big box of variance that breaks the rules and does everything differently. What is really cool, though, is that it honestly is kind of more of a, more than just the sum of its parts, because each character ends up making you focus on a different part of the game. So, for example, there was one character that I was playing that focused entirely on movement, and that was the whole strategy, was movement. There was another character that did nothing but focus on initiative and just sort of preventing you from getting initiative. There was another character that I played that focused on nothing but just delivering big hits and just sloughing off damage. All of those, yes, they're different powers and they're different, ways to play and strategies to win, but essentially at their core, what they're making you do is almost, I dare say it's almost like playing a different mini game, because you're playing the same game but with a totally different priority. And while we're both at the same table with the same cards on the same board, the game that you were playing and the game I was playing was different, even though the win condition was essentially the same.
Right, and a big part of that too, on as far as it being different little mini games, the further you progress into those characters, the more that rises to the front and makes it just an incredible design. Essentially, you're right. Like, there are a lot of those guys that are just manipulating an aspect of turn order, or an aspect of power management, or an aspect of movement, right? All that stuff is true. But then as you get into like the more advanced characters, they start literally being mini games. Like there's one character who starts with just nothing and is basically, you're assembling her as you play. So instead of having any stat fixed, it's a custom character that you are meant to evolve depending on who you are playing. It's a super advanced character just because it is literally, there's another board for her that you are essentially connecting these spots and leveling her up while you're playing. So not only is it a little bit of complication from that, but you also need to know what your weakness is against this person you're fighting so that you can, most readily pick the right path to address those weaknesses so you can win the fight. So there's things like that. But I mean, even more than that, there's guys that set traps all over the board, and I guess you could say that's a movement thing, but I don't know. It's almost more of like an anticipation thing, or it's more of a tempo thing. Mm-hmm. There's a character that puts puppets on the board, and she isn't even on the board. Like she jumps off the board and puts a puppet down, and then the puppet fights you. And then she can then switch places back and forth with the puppet to do all these crazy effects. Every single character is like that. Like there isn't one that's just like another one. And it's, even the simple characters on their own, like I would say that, and I forget her name, but the one you played last night that was basically she looks like a tree and she has a swarm of bees, right? Like, her shtick is to stand in the middle of the board and just pull you across her and then put a bee on you. Mm-hmm. And that's it. She either needs to run by you or have you run by her, and then she puts a bee on you that like stings you every turn. That sounds kind of simplistic, and it is. However, once you combine what she's trying to do with what random character X's wonky minigame needs him to do, suddenly you're jostling for position, and you're thinking 3 layers deeper than your very simplistic goal of I just need you to cross my path and I damage you, becomes this incredible puzzle of how exactly do I get you to cross my path? So even the simple characters take on all of this complexity when the objectives of their opponent is factored into the game that's happening, and it's just brilliant.
No, it is, and I'll take it one step further, and I'll say that the person who wins the game, in our case, which by the way, all of our games were tight, which was unbelievable. All of the games were tight. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, I would contend that the person who wins the game isn't just the person that can solve their mini game the best, because each of us has this little hand of tools in our cars this sort of helping us complete our objective. And by objective I don't mean depleting the other person's life points. I mean the objective of doing the thing that my character requires me to do to deplete your life points.
Right.
I have this little toolkit that the game gives me where I this says here's how you do this. But the thing is you have a toolkit too, and even though we're not playing identical games, the toolkits are so balanced that ultimately the person who wins the game isn't just the one that sort of figured out what was in their toolkit the quickest and then put it to use first. The person who wins the game is the person that can do that in addition to somehow using the other person's toolkit to accomplish their own minigame as well.
Right.
Which is another level of complexity that you wouldn't expect from a game that's simply about fighting.
Yeah, for sure. Right? It's you could almost say it's the player that kind of executes their combos the most time is the one who wins. Like if you really, really analyze it, the decks are set up to be played in a certain order. It's almost like there's a path. These two pairs go together. These two pairs go together. And if you can execute your hand of your 5 or 6 styles and your 5 or 6 moves, they're set up almost so that if you can execute those 6 times in a row, you win, right? And while that, again, sounds one-dimensional, in practice, because you have someone else getting in the way, right? The other guy doing his 6 combos, suddenly none of the combos are really working. Mm-hmm. So the player that wins ends up being the one who can... We played for 12 turns, and I fired off 3 combos, and you fired off 2. I'm probably going to win, and that's really, really cool because it brings in almost a resource management kind of thing, a hand management thing, which it very much is, mirroring the real video fighting video games. You have essentially combo moves are what wins the game.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Combo moves are what win the game. But since there's this positioning aspect, in addition to this hand management aspect, you may not have the positioning on the board or the thing in your hand that's going to let you do the combo that you need to win the game. And that's where playing across the table can be incredibly important. Because if you can kind of figure out what the other player is going to do, you can end up positioning yourself with a card you have into a place where your combo may be set up for the next turn, not because of what you did, because of what you assumed and then correctly reacted to them doing. And that's just, I mean, that's what a two-player duel game should feel like.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. You know, it's combos win the game. Duh. Yeah, of course they do. But that's what I'm saying. It's the person, because the game makes it so difficult to fire off those combos in order. The player who best navigates that and gets a couple of them to fire off in a row is going to win the game. That's representative of the genre, and brilliantly, again.
Which is, yeah, it's super cool. Well, the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of all the different characters and breaking it down into kind of thinking about it almost being a mini game, that's kind of an oversimplification. But in the very least, having them focus on different aspects of the game and capitalizing on those. One of the things that's kind of funny about that is that we've had this discussion, we'll probably have it 1,000 times more, just about how games are really good indicators of what kind of people we are intellectually, because you have this sort of starting point when you approach a game and a basic strategy and the things you look for to tell you that you're doing it right. And I'm the same way, and everyone that we play games with is the same way as well, which is why we can kind of point to a game and go, oh, this is a game where so-and-so is going to do really well. It's because we can line those things up. Well, what's really cool about a game like this is that, sure, with enough plays, I could figure out a character that was my play style, that fit right into the kind of gamer that I perceive myself to be, in addition to the kind of gamer that I am, that I don't perceive myself to be. I could figure that out, and I probably would do really well with the game. But what was fun was just reaching into that massive box of decks and pulling out something entirely random and going, let's make it happen. Because I think it was game 2 that I basically got handed the BattleCon equivalent of Street Fighter II Blanca or Super Smash Bros. Pikachu, where my job was just to sit there and just smash on the B button to just sort of dare you to walk into me. And I'm the kind of person who feels a little bit bad about doing those kinds of things typically. You know, not that I am one of those that is going to trash a game because I'm worried about hurting someone's feelings, but it's more just that in a two-player game, if you don't have a good time, that's 50% of the crowd. So it's a little bit more important to me, just on a social contract level, for us both to be enjoying it. And that kind of feels cheap. And so typically I would kind of shy away from that strategy in a two-player game. However, that was the game, and that was my strategy, and that was the only way to win with that deck, was just to use that situation to my advantage, and I did not feel guilty at all. It's awesome to kind of grow a little bit, maybe. I don't know if I'm growing into a worse person, maybe, but it was interesting to sort of see an aspect of gaming that I normally wouldn't take advantage of. And to kind of look at it and go, nope, this is a legitimate strategy.
Well, yeah, and being on the receiving end of that, I mean, I understand what you're saying, but as far as coming at it from the other side, even though that was incredibly irritating, and I was just firing off obscenities as fast as I could lay down cards and have them canceled, it ended up being, it wasn't so much annoying as it was this, like, how do I crack this egg? Like, this is impossible. The flip side of that is that because your character was a stand here and mash the B button and dare me to come close, you also weren't really advancing the game, right? So I had to figure out how to crack this nut, but at the same time, I had more time to figure out how to crack that nut than I would have had against another more aggressive fighter. You know, so and it may have, you know, I don't know if that's part of the design or if that was just lucky or if we're bad at the game, but you know, it just felt like that situation scaled perfectly.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And that's an aspect we've seen in other games too. I mean, you know, we've talked about this while playing WoW, you know, the TCG, where every now and then you pull out this deck with this big goofy grin that tells me, "Oh no, I'm going to hate every moment of this game." because you're going to have a deck that just undoes everything that I didn't even know I wanted to do. But those games end up being incredibly fun, not only the first time because we laugh at my misfortune, they end up being good rematches because they're really interesting puzzles. Now, you had to figure out the puzzle beforehand because you're the one who put together that deck and assembled the little trap, basically, for me. But I'm the one that then gets the sort of after puzzle that now I get to try to undo it.
Right.
And that's incredibly fun. And you see that in this game. And in addition to that just being a fun thing to do intellectually, it offers, again, sort of this other layer of game space that transcends what's going on the actual table, because it requires me to solve these complex puzzles, these big puzzles that you set up or that the game sets up. But it forces me to do it in ways that I maybe not do it just on my own accord, right? Because it's giving me a different toolkit than what I would normally be comfortable doing. I kind of just like that stuff personally, because I think it's fun to kind of look at myself and go, wow, I didn't realize that apparently it's really important to me to not be a jerk. I kind of thought I was a jerk, but apparently I'm overly sensitive about this stuff, and I need to pick Pikachu in Smash Brothers more often.
And that would, like, I would say that in some ways requires a certain type of gamer, a certain attitude of, I'm going to bash my head against this until I solve it. But again, BattleCon, even though it has that, like, that brick wall is there if you want to bash your head against it. Like, if you want to master this game, you got a long, hard road.
Yeah.
But as opposed to another game like, say, Mage Knight, which we've been talking about, it is not off-putting to someone who doesn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the casual button masher is going to have loads of fun with this. As much as the guy who wants to beat his head against a brick wall and solve it. It's equally fun for both parties, which, again, is another praise to sing. So yeah, I mean, I've kind of gloated about it as much as I can. I will say this, poking around, if you want to know more about it, there's a guy on YouTube, I believe he's operating out of the Philippines, but he goes by the name of Mechanicritic. And he's got a channel called Battle Chat, and he just talks about nothing but BattleCon all the time. He's got shows about single characters on how to maximize their use. He's got shows on learning, shows on basic combat, basic game theory. Just really, really great. And look it up if you're interested in this, because
yeah, absolutely. I came into level 99 later than when BattleCon came out. And so I was playing some of the later titles and really enjoying them and just thinking they're great. But I always kind of looked at BattleCon and said, that's the thing that he did originally and he's still doing it, and there's no way that it can be as good as this stuff now. Because, it's just a fighting game. I had that kind of stigma in my head. But two, it was one of his early titles. And so I didn't really think it was kind of worth going back to. And gosh, I was dead wrong.
No, again, this week or next week, I'll be out knocking on doors and saying, have you heard the message?
This segment is additionally brought to you by The Humble Segway. Thank you, Segway. And the Segway would like to remind you to join us on BetweenTurns.com, Facebook.com, or find our guild on BGG if you would like to join in the conversation. But for now, back to the show.
Not to beat a dead horse, but I do want to kind of ask you a follow-up question about planning game days, if I can.
Of course. What? Did you bring a goat? Did you bring proper sacrifices? You've approached the game wizard. What say you?
I just want to know if player count is a specific problem that comes up when you're trying to plan a night.
Oh, player count is the problem when it comes to planning game night. So many games have a specific player count. Either it's hard locked into being a 4-player game, 5-player game, or it's a game that is flexible but plays up to 6. But if you play with more than 4, it actually just completely implodes. There's too much downtime, there's not enough resources, or, what have you. It becomes too chaotic. There's tons and tons and tons of games that kind of have an optimal player count, but they are presented as playing a wide range. I think on those, there's not a really great way to suss out what those counts are other than just kind of trial and error. And ultimately, I don't think with those kind of games it is that big of a deal. Like, it's not going to ruin the experience if you play a game that's best with 4, but you play it with 5. For 90% of the people, they're not going to be able to tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
But I think where it becomes a problem with planning a game night is there are a legion of games, and they tend to fall into like the heavy strategic Euro. A lot of those are 4-player, and the issue with planning a game night is rarely do we have 4 players.
Mm-hmm.
It is almost always 5 or 6. That's not as big of a problem on a full-fledged, weekend, gaming weekend kind of thing where we have 10 hours on a Saturday and everybody's just kind of hanging around playing a game here and there. When you're having like an after-work Thursday night game night like we have, you've only got like 3 or 4 hours to work with. And if 6 people show up, that kind of disqualifies 80% of the games that we have. That is something that is really hard to work around, because if you want to play a heavy strategic Euro and it's going to be 4 players, you got to find something else for the other 2 guys to do. Or if you break up into 3 and 3, and also just as a host, that kind of feels a little bit weird to be like, thanks for coming over, and I'll go play over there. So that is a pretty tricky thing. It's part of, from like the previous conversation we had, that's one of the most frustrating factors in getting a lot of games tabled, is trying to plan, prepare, and then have an extra person show up. The most complicated situation is the 3-player game. And that's not too many people showing up. That's not quite enough showing up. Everyone who's gamed kind of understands the 3-player issue, right? That you end up in a spot where 2 players are in active opposition and the 3rd player just runs away unmolested and wins. That is something that happens in almost every game.
Which is why usually 3-player is kind of considered to be the player count that you see it on the box, but you immediately just discount it and go, we'll never try a 3-player.
Yeah. One genre I think that actually thrives in 3-player, that is, I think, the point salad games, or the multiplayer solitaire games more than the point salad. And I think, for all the flack that multiplayer solitaire gets from a lot of people, I think that the niche that it fills is the 3-player setup, because the very fact that it's not interactive means that whole issue of 2 players butting heads and the 3rd player running around the back door, that actually doesn't happen in multiplayer solitaire, because there is no confrontational spot to it that allows that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a space I think is not explored enough. When people dismiss the multiplayer solitaire, I think if those people were to embrace it for those situations where they've only got 3 guys that want to play, I think that addresses a lot of those problems.
The primary concerns that you're talking about with 3-player, again, that's based on that sort of fundamental game theory thing about either you always want to be the one negotiating with all parts of the opposition simultaneously, like that's the person who wins, the one who stays in negotiation with everyone. And then the opposing side of that is that in a 3-player game, you can simply do that by just not engaging in whatever the conflict is, because then those 2 people are in a negative negotiation, and you can stay in a positive negotiation by simply not engaging in the negative one. It's one of those things that while everyone says repeatedly that games are primarily social, what we see in the 3-player situation is that if games are primarily social, then there are certain limitations that have to happen mechanically, because social things work certain ways with certain numbers of people. So you have to go to something, like you say, with, a solitaire game that has maybe some sort of interaction, but it's limited interaction. So it undermines those, we'll say, ordering principles that come into situations that involve multiple people, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's there's exactly one exception that I've found that is a 3-player game that works Even though it has direct competition, tons of interaction, it technically even has negotiation, yet it plays specifically 3 people. And even that is almost its own problem, because not only does this game play 3 players incredibly well, featuring all those interactive mechanics, but it does so exclusively. Like, you can't play it with 2 players, you can't play it with 4 players. It is, you have 3 or you don't play this game. And that's 3 Kingdoms Redux. It's amazing how well it handles that situation of having 3 players engaged in this head-to-head conflict, yet it never lets any one of those players kind of run away from the conflict. The way that it does it, and I think it's brilliant, is that it has sort of the various arenas in which you are scored, and you're basically trying to run your empire domestically, have enough gold and food to kind of feed your people. You have to be able to raise and deploy armies to seize territory so you can win the War of the 3 Kingdoms. And you kind of have this area of kind of border skirmishes and some kind of earning status, with the emperor that is in power. So you kind of have these 5 avenues of running your empire, and you are doing all 5 of those in direct competition with the other 2 players. What that creates is this sort of, you're trying to keep 5 plates spinning in the air all at the same time. And instead of a direct, 2 players can't push on each other all that much, because if they do, the other 3 plates fall. So you're kind of in this little tug of war that's working 3 ways, where you're trying to keep those plates spinning, but finding a moment where you can just kind of poke and then keep spinning. That keeps everyone super engaged. But the other little piece of brilliance I think it has is that the final scoring that decides how this game works doesn't reward any one of those kind of 5 avenues to dominate the game, because it breaks down your performance, and instead of just it being worth like an undetermined number of points depending on how you did, it kind of caps everything to where it says, if you do the best in this, you get 5 points. If you're second best, you get 3 points. If you're the worst, you get nothing. And then it kind of goes through and scores all these aspects of your empire in that same way. So what that does is it kind of, again, reins in the ability of someone to just kind of throw the whole machine off kilter by going straight down this one path with everything they have. Well, in some ways that's a little bit artificial. It is the exact thing that tends to tilt a 3-player game, in other avenues. When other games fall apart at 3 players, it is generally because one player decided to just run down this one avenue and ignore everything else. And then the other players have to make a decision. Well, either I stop him, meaning now all these resources are being poured into stopping that guy and player 3 wins, or, you both ignore it and then player 1 wins because they are exploiting this one victory condition and no one's stopping them. Having kind of that cap on scoring, not only a cap, but actually I think more importantly an equal weight. Having an effective military is equally as important as having a good supply chain, which is equally as important as keeping tribal relations where they need to be, which is equally important to having the favor of the emperor, which is, equally important. And it just goes on and on and on. All this stuff, being that it's equally important, keeps that plate spinning exercise really, really tense the entire time you're doing it.
I absolutely agree. And I think that to break it down into chunks, right? To win the game, you simply have to do better than the other players in more categories than the other players, right? I mean, it's, just hypothetically, if there's 5, you have to win 3 of them.
Right.
That's just what it comes down to. But the interesting thing about that is that while that seems really simple, I pick my path, you pick yours, and we just run down it, the game does a very good job of kind of keeping the players at each other's throats in terms of pacing, because if I see that you've taken the lead, for example, on your market developments and your grain production, that kind of stuff, and you're pushing the game forward that way, and it looks like you're going to score big points there. If I just back off of that entirely, you have zero incentive to keep pursuing it. And what that means is that your resources that you would be using to pursue that, because it's a worker placement, it's all about the resource of how many actions do you take. If I just back off of that competition entirely, what I've essentially told you is that you will win these points, and you no longer for the rest of the game have to dedicate any resources to it. In which case, we now are just going to battle on a different front. Whereas if I can find a way to keep that pressure on you, I can tie up your resources and then go pursue something else. Because it's a 3-player game, some of it is looking at what the other people are doing and knowing that if Jeff is running away in this point over here, but I'm way far behind, then this is the responsibility of the second player to put pressure on Jeff. And so everyone ends up holding each other in this place of tension. And I think that's really, really interesting. And of course, like, it's not even something where the players have to know what they're doing to make that happen, because second place gets points too. And second place points are very important because, again, everything gets scored, and the scoring is really tight at the end. So there's a big incentive for the number 2 player to kind of stay ahead and keep putting pressure on something that they may or that they themselves may have given up hope of winning. And that creates a really cool tension there without arbitrarily forcing players to behave in ways that you wouldn't in a 3-player game. It's really cool, and kind of ends up making it seem organic to both look at someone and say, I'm not going to get in your face about this one particular theater of competition, and then immediately with the action that follows, do something that stabs him in the back on a different theater. And the whole game is built that way. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and even what I just said with the theaters being scored with like the 5 points, 2 points, 0 points, or 3 points, or whatever it is. That's a really macro, like, you have to step way back to kind of analyze that game is happening. Because, I mean, describing it that way makes it sound kind of a little bit uninteresting. But the game, you really got to take a long, far look at it to see that. Because the way the game is set up, it's so engrossing. And while there maybe is a little bit of handcuffs on because of that, you don't see them as handcuffs. You see them as like the pressures of running your faction. Because the other thing about it, and probably one of my favorite things about it, is the fact that it's completely asymmetric, and not sort of asymmetric like you often see where, all the factions kind of have access to the same stuff. Like, they may have a little bit of an advantage here or a little bit of an advantage here. In this game, if you play a different faction than you played last time you played it, you're going to have a vastly different experience, even though you are playing the same game and doing the same things. Because there's a deck of, like, I don't know, 40, 50 generals or something, and every single one of them is completely unique with its own kind of stats for what it can do, and also a special ability that is going to generally guide your hand, on which theater you're going to kind of go hard at based on the additional bonus that they provide you. And all of those factions, when you play them, they really do push you in different directions.
On top of that, the game even doles out those generals who are your actions, right? It's giving you additional actions per turn at different rates. So we all start with a different number of actions per turn. And then as the game progresses, we get given different numbers of actions per turn. So it's not even the theater that you end up sort of being aimed at is different, but the pace at which you pursue the game ends up being different in between the 3 factions too, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, it really is an amazing game design. All of those restraints, all of those little nudges that kind of push you down various paths, they are done so subtly that, at no time does that game ever feel like it's playing you. it's not one of those situations where you're like, well, I'm playing the cavalry faction, so my first 10 actions is going to be to build horses. Like, it's not like that. What you'll find is maybe this faction has a bunch of abilities that key off of ships, but it doesn't lock you into ships. It's just a bunch of little pivots that lets you kind of accentuate your navy every time you're doing something else. Or, when you take a straight up naval action, you get twice the benefit that you normally would. Again, it's done so subtly that you don't sit down and go, I'm playing the navy faction, so I'm building 10 boats and my first move is to attack the ocean. It doesn't do that somehow. Yet when you're playing and the game is over, you realize that you have kind of organically built this empire that has leveraged boats in tons of ways that no one else did, and it's all kind of just subtly driven by those general powers. It's really neat.
I think that breaking the game down into, saying that it's these chunks and these theaters, because that is a good way to look at it, because in its simplest form, that is the way it is. Now, they're all sort of threaded together, right? Everything kind of informs another area in terms of when you want to take it and maybe why you want to take it, setting up a later turn. However, the core conflict of the game, and there actually is a larger distribution of the points you get at the end of the game, comes from the actual conflict, like the war conflict, the controlling of areas in between the three players. But even that was done really, really well from a three-player standpoint, because let's back up. There actually are a lot of three-player specific war games that are all about fighting one another and controlling area and that kind of stuff. And they all have to come up with really clever ways to, again, get around that same problem of letting one person just sit back and have two other people sort of duke it out. What Three Kingdoms has done is that it has abstracted that warfare into these two little, almost like tug of wars. I have a tug of war that's going to you, and then one that's going to the other player. And then you have one that goes to me and the other player. And so each operational part of that battle is separated out so we can take it one little chunk at a time. However, while I can't affect what's going on the opposite side of the board from me, because it's cut off from me, because that's between the two of you, I can see what's going on. And I know that when you two are at each other's throats over there, that's when I need to jump in the little combat zones that I have to you and then to the other player. Which is exactly what happens in a three-player game that ruins three-player games. But in this one, they've actually created a situation where that is front and center. Like, that is the strategy. By pulling it out and making it a feature, instead of making the game break, it actually becomes one of the really cool tensions of the game, but also one of the things that, as a player, you have to do to succeed in the game. You have to watch that and be ready to pounce on it as soon as you see the opportunity. It's really, really cool. I mean, we've actually talked about this before with other games where funny little oddities that you think would break games sometimes become the game. And I think this is one of those examples.
Yeah, it is. And it also, like, another great tension point that when you're playing, again, like, just as a masterful design, I think most games that aren't negotiation games come down to math, right? What makes a game fun and interesting is the author's ability to hide the math. I think one of the for somebody who's just a fan of that sort of thing, of just seeing kind of like, the artistry or the engineering of a game design, I can't get over it enough how well, Three Kingdoms, like, I can identify those spots where it is kind of artificially creating that environment, but it is so well hidden and it's so far below the surface that at no time does it feel constraining. And one of what I think is the most creative point of tension the game makes is, as you mentioned, your generals are your workers. Those generals are what allow you to take your actions. And if you have 5 generals, you get 5 actions. If you have 7 generals, you get 7 actions. But what creates an amazing piece of tension that works for gameplay balance and to rein that stuff in, but also works thematically, is that when you take over an area, like when you fight one of those pitched battles you talked about, and you win, well, not only do you win and you win a few points from that, but you have to deploy that general that won the battle as a governor into that province. And there's no gameplay function of that really anymore. However, you've just paid a price in that holding that province has now cost you an action for the rest of the game, and it has also cost you one of your generals and their general power that does all kinds of cool things. And it is such a neat way of kind of reining in that power again. Like you said, the military is the only scoring in that game that isn't on that metered 5-point, 2-point, no points thing. The military, if you can hold these provinces, the earlier you get them and the longer you hold them, the more points you get. However, the price you pay for that is if you deploy your armies early and you make a big military surge and you score a ton of points from that military, you then play the rest of the game being 3 or 4 actions behind everyone because your generals are governing. They're not actually contributing to building your empire.
Yeah. Well, and on top of the cost, right, of holding the empire, because there's upkeep. So what it means is that you've not only hamstrung yourself in terms of actions, but you've also increased the demand for resources that you're supposed to be producing with those actions. So it's kind of a double whammy. Like, sure, you got the points, but, you've really hurt your ability to sort of maintain that status
right.
quo.
And last time we played, I did do that strategy. Like, I went big early. The set of generals that I was awarded at the beginning of the game to start it were all guys who were like, build boats, sail, conquer. Like, I drew the Viking hand. I'm like, okay. And I did it. And, ultimately, I pursued it and I paid a heavy cost. Like, the entire game, I was barely feeding my troops. I was barely generating enough gold to sustain my infrastructure. It was a slog. So I paid a huge price for getting that big military bump. But even though I paid that price, I did almost win. So it both feels like it's been limited, but not neutered. Like, you can still do it. It just becomes another, like, a risk reward thing.
And it's pace too, right? Because your particular house, I guess, was the one that started out with the most characters, if I recall correctly. So you had more starting resources that you could rush out there and accomplish those things, whereas I was playing the Han Shu, who starts with very few numbers.
Right.
And they sort of come in later in the game. Had I done that early on, I would have shut myself out because I wouldn't have had the resources to feed my troops and pay them and that kind of stuff. And so some of that too is understanding the asymmetry of the characters. But once again, I think that this is where taking the idiosyncrasies of a 3-player system in terms of what you have to do to sort of solve that problem from a game theory standpoint, and putting all that stuff out there front and center and accentuating the difficulties of it has turned into just making this a really, really cool game.
It feels appropriate to the theme they are trying to deliver, and all these limitations and all these struggles. They don't feel artificial. They feel like you are living that period of history, trying to juggle the things that were being juggled and trying to navigate things that need to be navigated. Super, super cool. And the other thing I like it too, and this is another, not to harp on it, but another piece of wizardry, is the fact that the game plays out. I mentioned that there's like 40 generals or whatever in the deck. Like, it's a lot. You only use like 12 of them on any given game. And they're shuffled up and kind of dealt to you, and you draft them out. And that is, as someone who, if you love card games, that is a big part of this game, is that there's kind of a card draft for these general powers, and the powers themselves act almost like a CCG, where you're kind of, responding to other things and triggering effects and doing all this neat card play. While you're doing that, though, you're only seeing, like, you probably see 3/4 of your deck as far as actually visually view it, but you only get to use 1/4 of it, if that. So every time you play, you end up with this completely different set of tools to try to solve this puzzle with. They can be pretty radically different, you know. I mean, that you can you can play a game where you're dealing with nothing but administrators, and you can play another game where you're, you know, like that game that we played most recently, where I was dealt just a bunch of warfare guys, and it's like, I'm going to war, and that's what I'm going to have to deal with. And the fact that that kind of variability is there is so cool. The wizardry part comes from the fact that knowing you're going to get a random sampling of these guys every game, and having the game still function as tightly and thematically as it does, it's just astounding to me that it works. But you need to want this to try it, but it is so worth it to track it down and experience it.
The funny thing about that 3-player count, right, is we talk about, well, especially nowadays with legacy games and that kind of stuff, it's not an uncommon thing to have a conversation with a group of people where you say, we're going to have a board gaming event. I've seen groups put up sign-up sheets for legacy games and that kind of stuff, where everyone is like, they're committing to this, we're doing it, we're going to make it happen as an event. And it's weird to think about, and even the last time that we kind of talked about the difficulties of setting up groups and getting certain games on the table, even in that discussion, nowhere was it in either of our minds that, no, you just say, hey, here's the game we want to play as an event. Like, today is 18xx day, and this is what we're doing. But I think that it's totally worthwhile to check out a game like this that's really unique, that you wouldn't just pull out in everyday gameplay because of the player count limitation, and make it an event with 2 friends. You know, find 2 people that you love playing games with and try it out, because it'll be a unique experience for all 3 of you, because it is unique. I mean, there's just not many 3-player games. I was really thinking about it, and aside from war games, which, I mean, and there are some war games out there that are built for 3 players that are really cool and find some interesting ways to solve the problems, but they're war games. Like, they're not going to find that appeal on most everyone's table. There's really only a handful of them that are at a fixed 3. I'm not talking about, 3 to 5 or 2 to 5, and you can be 3 players if you just, want to frustrate everybody by playing a game that doesn't really work at that game count, just because they wanted to have a dash instead of a comma when they did their play counts. But there's just not many of them. I think part of it is maybe because of the stigma, but some of it could be because of how difficult it is to do. However, you wouldn't know that it's difficult to do because this game does it so easily.
Yeah, there's nothing like it. Like it, I don't want to oversell it. I mean, there's people that will play it and not like it. If you're not a worker placement fan,
well, naturally,
there's a likelihood you won't like it. If you don't like, I'll say, fiddliness, for lack of a better word, of having to track 6 or 7 card powers at a time and know that you have this thing to trigger this power at this moment, for maximum gain. Those are things that are kind of player specific, that if you cut your teeth on card games or, collectible games, and you're kind of used to that kind of Magic the Gathering tracking statuses and stuff, you would love this game. Like, it's got all that. And if you're someone who is really turned off by that, this game may turn you off because of that. So again, I don't want to oversell it that this game belongs in every collection, because absolutely there's going to be people that don't enjoy what it offers. But if any of the stuff we talked about sounds interesting, I am confident in saying there is nothing like this game that has ever been published. There's nothing like it. That it handles those things, the way it handles those things, and like you said, just the fact that it's an odd bird of being 3 players, no more, no less, strictly 3, go. It's amazing. And also the fact that the 3 Kingdoms period is so incredibly rich with stories and tales, and it's criminal that it isn't explored more.
Oh yeah, it is one of the coolest sort of like historical fables that are built around tales of heroism.
It's akin to like the Persian Wars, the Alexander the Great stuff, and the 300. It's akin to that period,
but on a much more massive scale, because we're talking about huge armies with tons of people that are really fleshed out, and it's just unbelievably fascinating. And like you say, it is a shame that it's not front and center as a thematic standby for board games. I have nothing to add.